Chapter 20, Version C. Wadsworth switched the lights back on. The guests fell back against the various walls and surreptitiously counted their number to make certain no one else had been murdered in the 2-second interval of darkness. In the dark, the murderer ran from here across the hall to the study, got the rope and the lead pipe, then ran to the billiard room and strangled Yvette. Mrs. White stood in, involuntarily for Yvette, and was just about throttled in the process. The other guests were nearly trampled as Wadsworth ran from room to room, pointing and miming his breakneck recitation. It was so fast and full of fury that it was impossible to understand, except on a mostly subconscious level. Ran across the library, hit the cop on the lead pipe. It was coming out of the library, saw automobile lights come up the drive. It was the singing telegram girl, and the murderer picked up the gun where Yvette left it here beside the lounge door, opened the front door, recognized the singing telegram girl from a photograph, and shot her, then ran back to the cellar. Winded, Wadsworth wound down. The significance of the last part's speech sank during his panting silence. "The cellar?" they all cried. "Yes," gasped Wadsworth. "But Colonel Mustard wasn't in the cellar," said Mrs. Peacock. "No, but you were." "Me?" Miss Peacock said uneasily. "What's it got to do with me?" "You did it. You and Professor Plum together. You were in league with each other." Mrs. Peacock and Professor Plum avoided looking at one another. The others did enough of that sort of thing for them. In fact, Mr. Green, Miss Scarlet, Miss White, and Colonel Mustard fairly gaped. "Think back," said Wadsworth. "Miss Peacock was missing when the cook and Mr. Body were murdered. And the cook used to be your cook, Miss Peacock. Don't you remember your fatal mistake?" With his wind back, Wadsworth sprinted to the dining room. The others followed, and by the time they'd got there, Wadsworth was seated in Mrs. Peacock's place. "Sitting here, you told us all at dinner that we were eating one of your favorite recipes." Then he went on significantly, "But monkey's brains, though popular in Cantonese cuisine, are not often to be found in Washington, D.C. "Is that what we ate?" said Mr. Green. "Are there any brains to be found in Washington, D.C.?" Miss Scarlet asked wryly. Mrs. Peacock trembled. "She was my cook, I don't deny it. That doesn't prove I murdered anyone." "And what's it got to do with me?" demanded Professor Plum. Mr. Wadsworth hopped across to Professor Plum's place at the table. "You knew that Mr. Bly was still alive. Even psychiatrists can tell the difference between patients who are alive or dead. You fired the gun at him in the dark, but missed. Then you dropped the gun and pretended he was dead. And that's when you did it. The 4 other murders were easy. Luck was on your side. You drew lots to search the house together. So while we were all occupied searching the rest of the house, you burned the evidence, killed the motorists, and switched off the electricity and killed the others." The guests all stood about, trying to take this in. "So, Mr. Green at last, it had nothing to do at all with the disappearing nuclear physicist and Colonel Mustard's work on the new fusion bomb?" "No," said Wadsworth. "Communism was just a red herring." Mrs. White, however, remained puzzled. "But why did they kill all these people?" "We didn't," cried the accused. "There's no possible explanation," said Wadsworth. "I think there is," said Professor Plum, who looked to have been thinking fast. Slowly, he walked the length of the dining room, through the swinging door, and into the kitchen. The others followed curiously, and when they entered, they found Professor Plum staring into the recess of the cupboard that contained the secret passage. "Wadsworth," he said, "you knew about the secret passages. And when we drew lots, you held the matchsticks in your hand. You could have made sure Miss Peacock and I went to the cellar together." "It's a frame-up," Mr. Green called out excitedly. "No, it isn't," snarled Wadsworth. "I'll tell you how we found out," said Professor Plum, calmly smiling. "The gun's missing, right? Everybody turn out your pockets and purses. Whoever's got the gun shot the singing telegram girl." Wadsworth didn't hesitate. He instantly produced the gun from his pocket. "Very clever, Professor." The others drew back, aghast. "You killed that girl?" asked Miss Scarlet, braver and somehow offended by this murder more than the others. "He killed all of them," Professor Plum said quietly. "He did?" cried Mr. Green. "Of course," said the professor. "Who knew every detail about us all? Who brought us here and Mr. Body and all the victims? Who had the key to the cupboard with the weapons?" "But," Colonel Mustard broke in suddenly, "he said the cook was murdered when we were all standing in the library doorway with Yvette, so it couldn't have been Wadsworth. He was there beside me." "But I was lying," Wadsworth said, smiling smoothly. "That's not when she was murdered. I killed the cook early on, when Mr. Body was on the floor in the study, and you were all clustered around him. It took no time at all. You see, as Professor Plum realized, I knew about the secret passage from the study to the kitchen." "Well, the police will be here any minute," said Mrs. White. "You'll never get away with it." "Why should the police come?" Wadsworth said. "Nobody's called them." "Oh, my God, of course not!" cried Miss Scarlet with sudden terrible realization. "Why did you do it?" asked Mrs. White. "Would you believe me if I said it was to rid the world of an appalling blackmailer and his disgusting informers?" "No," said Mr. Green. "And you'd be right," Wadsworth returned cheerfully. "No, all my life has been spent in a struggle for perfection. I tried to be the perfect husband, but my wife killed herself. I strove to be the perfect butler, but I was driven to killing my employer. So I resolved that, in doing so, I would commit the perfect murder. But there's no pleasure in my triumph without an audience to admire it. And, as none of you had the brains to expose me, I decided I must expose myself." "Good God, man!" cried Colonel Mustard. "There are ladies present." "But you didn't commit the perfect murder," Professor Plum pointed out. "There's 6 witnesses to your confession." "Not for long, Professor. When the police eventually get here, they'll find 12 bodies, and no explanation." "12?" said Mrs. Peacock. "There are only 6." Wadsworth laughed the laugh of a maniac, a cheerful maniac at that. "The champagne was poisoned. If you don't get an antidote in 3 hours, you'll die. All of you, and I'm leaving now and locking you in." He flung himself through the door into the hall. He ran its length, threw itself into the study, and ripped the telephone cord from the wall. "There's no escape!" he shouted. His chortle echoing, he ran across the hall into the library and ripped the telephone cord from the floor. "You're doomed!" he screamed. "The 6 of you will die terrible deaths." He flung himself into the study, jerked the phone from the table, and tore the cord with his teeth. Then he flung both pieces at the horrified group standing in the doorway. He laughed a moonstruck laugh that made them all shiver. Clang! Wadsworth's laugh broke off abruptly at the sound of the doorbell. "Don't move, any of you." He hurried to the door, but they all blocked his path out to the hall. "Get out of the way. You said don't move," Mrs. White reminded him. He pushed through, and the gun grasped behind his back opened the front door. The elderly evangelist smiled. "I thought we told you to get lost," said Wadsworth. "Yes, but—" Wadsworth brought the gun around slowly. "Scram, you stupid old—" The elderly evangelist lunged forward, grabbing Wadsworth's wrist. He twisted expectantly, but not before Wadsworth squeezed off a shot. The bullet went wild. 6 cops boiled out of the shrubbery and overpowered Wadsworth. The 6 guests ran out into the porch, screaming variously they had been poisoned, that Wadsworth was the maniac who had done it, and that they had all very much appreciated a lift to the nearest hospital. "Hands up," said the elderly evangelist. Using Wadsworth's gun as a prod, he nudged the 6 dead back into the house. "Check the rooms," he said to the cops, and immediately the policemen raced into all the rooms on the first floor. 2 more held Wadsworth in vice grips. The elderly evangelist looked at the 6 guests with a cold, hard eye. Suddenly, and in unison, 3 cops burst from the library, the billiard room, and the library, crying, "There's a body in there!" They stopped and stared at one another. "What?" Then, more slowly, but still in unison, and each pointing behind him, said, "There's a body in there!" A 4th cop shot out of the study, his eyes wide with terror. "There's 3 bodies in there!" "3 more?" cried the other cops. "What do you mean 3 more? "Who are you?" Wadsworth demanded of the elderly evangelist, perhaps deducing that this was not his true or primary identity. "FBI," said the evangelist, smoothing profusely a badge from an inner pocket. "They sent me to clean up these murders." "Is that why it's run by a man called Hoover?" asked Wadsworth with a sly grin. "Who's responsible for these deaths?" asked the FBI evangelist. "He is," cried all 6 of the guests, pointing at Wadsworth. "All of them?" It's true, admitted Wadsworth. "It was the perfect murder. Let me show you how I did it." With a gesture of prod insouciance, he begged released. The evangelist gave a high sign, and the 2 cops holding Wadsworth released their grips. Wadsworth cleared a space and took off at top speed. At the start of the evening, Yvette was in the library by herself, waiting to pour champagne. I was in the hall, the cook was in the kitchen, the doorbell rang, clang, clang. Wadsworth ran to answer the front door, threw it open, but instead of miming his greeting to Colonel Mustard, he simply stepped out onto the porch and slammed the door shut behind him. Then he plucked a key from his pocket, inserted it into the lock, and turned it. Hammer blows sounded on the door from inside. He heard screams and frantic yelling. Wadsworth smiled. He jumped into the nearest black and white police car, started the engine, and pulled away down the drive. When he turned off the irritating static of the police radio, he heard a terrific shattering of glass, which suppose must have been guests, agents, and policemen smashing through the windows of the conservatory. He waited for the noise of the Dobermans going after them, but when it came, grrr, it was entirely too close. And so was the smell of wet fur, and the stink of something else that had to do with dogs. When he looked in the rearview mirror, what Wadsworth saw was a double row of slathering teeth. He turned and stared into the back seat. There were 3 of them, poised to pounce, and pounce they did.